All right, welcome everyone to South Asia seminar lecture series. This lecture series is called Imagining the Environment. And many of you who would have joined before knows that this lecture series is drawn out of the spring semester seminar series called Perceptions of Environment, where lots of PhDs and postdocs have presented drafts of their paper. Now, what is different from Perceptions of Environment is that this is a lecture series which combines distinguished academics, activists, and journalists. It started in mid of August and it will run up to the end of this month. So far, we have had about 10 speakers and most of the lectures have been recorded. At the end of this lecture series, I'm going to put out all the recordings in a tweet thread that I did more or less similarly for advertising this series. So if you've not attended some of these talks, please do not fret. You will have access to the videos. I'm Rahul Ranjan. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at the Oslo Metropolitan University. I work on a project called Riverine Rights that looks at 3 case studies of legal personhood in Colombia, New Zealand, and in India. Within the project, I have my own proposal that looks at role of grief, memory, and disaster in relation to rights of rivers in India. I'm very happy that today Professor Rohan D'Souza has accepted our request to speak. But before introducing him, I'd like you to know a few logistic issues. One is that to ask your question, you can use the chat box. So you can write your question into the chat box and I can have it read for you at the end of the talk. Other way is to just use the emoji sign, raise your hand, and I'll have you unmuted and you can ask your question yourself. So and in this passage, Rohan will speak for about 45 to 50 minutes, and we would have about half an hour for discussions. So have your questions ready by the end of it. I'm very delighted and honored that Professor Rohan D'Souza has accepted my request to come and speak on the series. I have personally known Rohan's work since I was an MA student and MPhil at JNU and have benefited a lot. Professor Rohan D'Souza is a professor of history at the Graduate School of Asian and African Area Studies at Kyoto University in Japan. He was elected as the General Secretary of Jawaharlal Nehru University Students' Union in 1989 and 90 on the political platform of All India Students Federation. He's the author of a very remarkable book called Drowned and Damned, Colonial Capitalism and Flood Controls in Eastern India, published by the Oxford University Press in 2006. This is also a text that forms basis for several of us who are working on dams, water, and river. Among other, he has a list of publication, but some of that includes edited volume, including The British Empire and the Natural World, Environmental Encounters in South Asia in 2011, Commonwealth, Forestry and Environmental History, Empire and Forest and Colonial Environment in Africa, Caribbean, South Asia, and New Zealand, published in 2020. You can look at his profile. There's a long list of publications that you can benefit from. But for now, I'm very delighted, Rohan, that you've accepted to speak today. So welcome.
Thank you, Rahul, for that very kind introduction. I must say that I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking here. And I'm going to start immediately by getting onto the share screen, yeah? So give me a minute. I make sure that I have the right screen on. Thank you. Okay, is that right?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, I'll just make sure that it moves. Okay, no, you know what? This is the wrong screen. Okay. There's 2 opened on my, I think I have to go in for the second one. Okay, sorry. These, right, and then I have to, okay. Maybe this works. Yes, this is the one. Okay, great. Okay, again, thank you again, Rahul. Let me start. All right, from the title, you will see that it's going to be a talk on engineering and on South Asia and rivers, yeah? But before I sort of begin my presentation, I really would like to put forward some big questions at the start. That is, when we have something like irrigation, what in colonial India, what are the big questions that have been posed earlier? And one of the big questions has been, the debate whether irrigation was it indeed one of the greatest monuments to British rule? That is, the railways and perennial irrigation for all the oppression, exploitation, and suffering at the end of the empire. Did it amount to actually being a substantial sort of contribution to South Asia? Well, there was one debate that took that issue up. In 1972, Elizabeth Whitcomb brought out a book called Agrarian Conditions in Northern India, where she did the reverse. She argued that actually the canal system wrecked local irrigation systems. They actually impoverished a lot of people. And yes, commercial agriculture did well, but at the cost of subsistence agriculture. Yeah. Now, this was published in 1972, and in 1985, Ian Stone kind of in a very considered way reopened the issue, revisited the archives, redid all the, reassessed a lot of Whitcomb's claims. And I won't rehearse that here, but at the end of Ian Stone's book, it pretty much says that, yeah, there were problems, but there were great contributions, great economic benefits as well. So it kind of evened out in the long run. It wasn't the nightmare that Whitcomb made it out to be, nor was it something you could celebrate in an unqualified way that earlier British officials and administrators, and even perhaps some of these Indian political figures have made it out to be. Yeah, pretty much for a long time, things went quiet on water management and irrigation and those technologies. But we have seen some sort of huge revival of interest in water. And I'm just listing a recent collection. I mean, there are many more books coming out, and I'm slightly horrified because, well, I'm absolutely delighted there's so much more work, but I've had to review a lot of them. And many of them are of incredibly, I would say, cutting edge contributions to history as a field, to the study of water, irrigation, and so on and so forth. And I'm just flagging a few. Sunil Amrit's, of course, 2018, Unruly Waters. There's Devjani Bhattacharya, I believe she also spoke in this series, Empire, Ecology, and the Bengal Delta. First rate, it's a fabulous read. I've had great opportunity to read it as well and review it, sorry. Arupjyoti Saikya's book is just out, The Unquiet River. Again, an absolutely fantastic contribution. You also have Sudipto Sen's Ganges and David Gilmartin, Blood and Water. I mean, just to sort of bring up a few of these great contributions to this the study of water. But there's also one more book that I'd like to flag, which is actually quite incredible in many ways. I've also done a very substantial review of it. And it's a very careful, it requires a very careful read. It's got a huge number of maps and all kinds of figures and abstract drawings and so on and so forth. This is by Dilip Dakuna, The Invention of Rivers. I think Dilip is saying more than irrigation and rivers. He's telling us that India, conceptualized as a land of many rivers, was actually not a land of many rivers, but an ocean of rain. And he basically wants us to reconceptualize the landscape itself around the idea of rain rather than rivers. So I'd really urge many of you all that this is a really important and significant book. And in my own estimate, it is a critical rereading of the idea of geography itself, of how we actually understood and looked at India. So now, given this huge burst of writings on rivers and on irrigation and on water studies per se, what can we possibly say that is new now, given the fact that it's a fairly crowded field at one level? My submission, and for the purpose of the talk, is to really say that I'm not yet sure that anyone has deeply probed the relationship between technology as ideology. That is to say that, have we looked at the irrigation structures, the designs, the engineering imagination as a kind of worldview? And I think that's still something that needs to be explored. And I'm going to try very tentatively attempt it here with all qualifications and cautions. And if there are questions at the end of this, it will be added to my kitty of learning from this exercise. Yeah, and my attempt here will be to do the following. Given my reading in the subject, and I have made some efforts to address this earlier in earlier writings, and I'm happy to discuss that towards the end. But I see the difference between what I call, well, not I call, but what is referred to as perennial irrigation and that of inundation irrigation, not as a difference of techniques and technologies, but really a clash of worldviews. And in my presentation for the next 30 or 40 minutes, that is exactly what I'm going to be trying to aim to do. All right. So, but I was also unclear whether the audience here was familiar with Indian historiography and the big understandings of the colonial period and so on and so forth. So I've taken the liberty of actually doing a quick 101. So those of you who are aware of those issues and those debates, there's a time to perhaps relax on my voice and take it a bit easy, but there's just 2 or 3 slides. But I'm just going to rehearse it in a very general and broad way. So one of the things that most students on what is called modern India, or the studies on colonial India or colonial South Asia, if you wish, they're familiar with the emergence of the colonial project in India, in British India, what became British India, and it starts with trade. And this was a time of British expansion as well, and you can see these the pictures that I have on my screen. By 1920s, for example, this was a huge empire. From Canada to Australia, large chunks of what is today Africa, the Middle East, and of course you can see the jewel in the crown, India as well. Yeah, but it starts with trade, and usually the phase is 1600 to 1960, and it's really driven initially by the East India Company, and so there's another dimension to the trade, and that dimension is that it initially starts out with trying to capture the trade on spice. And the trade on spice is basically on the East Coast, right? West Coast, sorry, what is now Kerala and so on and so forth. Somewhere in the middle of the 18th century, it begins to shift to the West Coast. And it's no longer spice. It's now trying to basically get their hands on cotton, chintz, manufactured goods, really. So you get the shift from the West Coast to the East Coast. And by the time they have a substantial presence in Bengal and Calcutta, there's a huge trade on manufactures, and slowly the company gets itself involved in the entire political process as well of the pre-colonial India, so to speak. And invariably, I'm not going to get into all those machinations and all those calculations and questions of war and so on and so forth. But what does happen is in 1764, a substantial battle at Buxar, which is now Bihar, in which the British East India Company, few thousand men basically defeat the Nawab of Bengal, the Nawab of Awadh, and Shah Alam II, the last, not the last, but amongst the last of the Mughal emperors. And after this defeat, a treaty was signed at Buxar, at Allahabad, sorry, and it was called the Grant of Diwani, 1765. What is significant for those of us who study South Asia, the colonial period at least, the most significant outcome of this Grant of Diwani was finally the company was going to be making more money out of the land revenue than trade. So this is now a big shift. It's no longer a bunch of merchants scrambling around for manufactures, but actually a kind of company that now has a military presence and capable of extracting revenue from the productivity of the land itself. Now, when you get this shift, often referred to as trade turns into territory, the company now is actively at war trying to get more and more land because more land means more revenue, right? And so there's a hugely changed dynamic after 1765 in the company holdings in India, and fast becoming what was quickly to become British India. Yeah? So there was a company presence that keeps growing, and control and command over resources was taking place. But at heart, while all this is happening, it is a big shift towards the land tax. All right. Now, this is a very significant moment. And I would flag the wonderful book by Professor Niladri Bhattacharya, 2019. I think this is a path-breaking book. And anyone who's serious about South Asian colonial period, I think this is a must read. There's no way around it. Niladri's argument, it's called The Great Agrarian Conquest, is simply at one level saying that the idea of a village India, of an agrarian India, of a society driven by agricultural production, this idea actually is something that the British consolidate. That prior to the British presence, the land tax was, of course, important, but was not central. That is to say that there were a portfolio of livelihood possibilities, from trade to mercenary, kind of behavior as warriors on rent, to foresters, to all kinds of to living in forests and so on and so forth. There's a wide range of activities that people carried out. And that with the emergence of the and consolidation of the British Empire, there was a kind of a squeeze to get people to basically get focused on agriculture because the land tax. And mind you, not till 1924, when finally the British made more money from industry and commerce and finance and so on and so forth, that the land tax actually came as a second stream of income. So throughout the 19th century, the land tax was really the peasant carried the empire, roughly stated. Yeah. Now, the land tax as a question also comes with its second understanding. And this is where I want to come in with the idea of irrigation. you will see that many of the early British administrators and also the engineers that were brought in, they kind of crafted this imagination of the centrality of irrigation to productivity and profit. Yeah. So you get P.T. Cotley, more about him later, who one of the big engineers of the British Empire, who writes in 1949, amongst many early writings. There are many early writings, but I'm sort of just taking one of them to exemplify a broad set of writings on the subject. He writes, to dwell on the importance of an abundant supply of water to the progress of tropical agriculture is unnecessary. Without it produces inferior alike in quality and quantity. That is to say, devoting their resources to the construction of tanks, of bunds, or canals, they have, that is the local peasants, they have extended cultivation and relieved it from dependence on variable and uncertain seasons. Cotley is basically further elaborating this belief that India, which is now becoming British India is really a land of the peasant. And this peasant is very keen on irrigation because that's his safety and security from the variability of season. Yeah. And so anyone who can enable irrigation can actually enhance production and can actually be a very important and substantial player in the fortunes of British India. Yeah. And in some way, it was about naturalizing artificial irrigation. Ultimately, of course, this is irrigation supposed to be artificial, right? The rains are natural ways of irrigation, but building canal systems or tanks or bunds is artificial irrigation. But you naturalize it that is what really defines the possibility and potential of the peasant. Yeah. Once they begin to start making this link between irrigation and productivity and land tax and agriculture, you get a kind of curiosity about, the British coming in saying, okay, there must be these huge irrigation systems prior to us coming. So let us figure out what it was like. And this is mostly in, it's called the Gangetic Belt area, the Indus system and the Ganga system, where some of these initial inquiries, there was of course a lot going on in the south, but I'll come to that later. And here's some observations that they make, which is kind of confusing for them. The first Indian canals, object of its construction seems to have been the increase of imperial luxury rather than the advancement of the prosperity of the country. Now, this is a bit surprising. If irrigation is so critical, so important, why is it just a question of imperial luxury? I mean, what is it? Were the Mughals and the Nawabs and all the ruling elite just completely isolated from what their people required? And they write solely, many of the canals, they say, solely to supply the fountains or water the gardens or fill the wells around his, that is Sultan Firoz, for example, who had a huge inundation irrigation system, favorite hunting palace of Hisar. So they say that here's something about given the importance of irrigation, what are we finding? We are finding that actually the Oriental despot, he is using irrigation to celebrate his own privilege and his own kind of luxuries, yeah? Which is how the British are now beginning to formulate the idea of irrigation prior to their intervention, okay? So we have an interesting kind of discourse that's going on. On one level, British administrators, engineers are arguing almost frantically that irrigation is the defining intervention of the British Empire in British India. Yeah. And at the other level, they're finding that there is the path to this is kind of a bit dodgy. Most of the previous constructions of irrigation channels and canals seemed to suggest that it was a very much for luxury. So there is this kind of, parallel discourse going on, not really connecting. And now let me just, that while all these discussions are going on, there is the incredible stories of two remarkable British engineers, and captured wonderfully in a book that comes out in 2006 by Alan Robertson. Sadly, he passed away before the book came out, but apparently his wife and many of his friends and colleagues got around together and put together the manuscript. It's a difficult book to get. I'm very fortunate amongst all the the serendipitous luck that I've had so far as an academic. I'd rate getting this book at a very accessible price as being one of them. So the book is called Epic Engineering, beautifully written, very accessible. He discusses the lives, the challenges, the contradictions, the kinds of, both of them, by the way, had very severe disagreements. And that's a long story. I won't get into that plot. I have another talk that I've given, which kind of detailed much more of their disagreements. But for the purpose of today, what is important to note is that both of them headed two schools of irrigation engineers. One was called the Bengal School of Engineering, very plain, straightforward. And this is P.T. Cotley on the Ganges, on the Ganga and the northern rivers. The second was called the Madras Chief School of Engineering. And this is Arthur Cotton. Okay. And so I'll just briefly rehearse not what they did and, the many, both of them, have written extensively, and there's a huge amount of literature that, frankly speaking, I don't think it makes sense for me to walk you through that right now. But I just want to mention very briefly the underlying principles that seem to frame how they looked at the question of irrigation. Yeah. So if you look at Arthur Cotton, he was very clear: irrigation is equal to land revenue. All right. And so he lists in a kind of absolutely clear, uncomplicated way. He says his chief, this is by his daughter, by the way, Lady Hope, who writes a biography of Arthur Cotton. She writes, his chief problem was how to deal with the river and bring it under control, and how not to let the water run to waste to the sea. As plainly stated as that the river by itself will take its waters and empty it wastefully into the sea. And to the districts of Godavari, she writes that he also, Arthur Cotton, was very concerned that the thing about these rivers was that they also flooded and they caused immense destruction, or there was this drought, which is a loss. So he thought that, unless you bring rivers under control, you can't make them productive. And so he had, amongst many suggestions, and there are many writings, but roughly he had three points to fulfill. One is you have to regulate the rivers. So you build wires or barrages, then you embank them so that you can, the idea is to regulate, equalize the flows, and stabilize the river, because by itself, it's too wild. So there's a lot of construction like embankments, dams with channels for irrigation, surplus channels to lead off the floods, and so on and so forth. But underlying all of it was rivers cannot be left to themselves. They have to be regulated, they have to be equalized, they have to be controlled. Cotton built, anicuts are basically different kinds of wires or dams. You put it in the middle of the river, the bed of the river, and you make sure that you control the flow so that you can sometimes impound the water during low flows so that you have a large lake, and then release, then slowly leak that water out to a canal system. Or if there's a huge amount of water, then you keep the gates open and let the water flow. So it was that basic kind of sense of regulation. And he had fairly good success with building anicuts on the Krishna River, the Godavari River, and the Kaveri River, all the southern rivers. Now, there's a little catch to this in the sense that it's often written that these were all very, very successful projects. they were in some ways, but success is also the result of an accounting procedure. Before 1854, all projects, the accounting procedure was such that it was part of the annual revenue. So each individual project did not make sense. It was at the end of the year, did your revenue increase or did it not increase? Yeah. And if it did not increase, meet all your administration costs and more than what you spent, then you had obviously a loss. But Cotton was lucky that he built all these projects. The claim was they delivered a lot of profits, and he was quite a star by the 1850s and 1860s. Yeah, and both of them, incidentally, were from Addiscombe Seminary. They studied together, and probably that accounts for some of the bitterness that they had, probably peer group bitterness. Proby Cotley built from 1842 to 1854 the Ganges Canal, yeah, what came to be known as the Ganges Canal. And he had to deal with very different kinds of logistical challenges. But if you look at the principles, he's kind of similar to Cotton. He looks at rivers that, they are designed by nature for, he sees them as really great sources of irrigation. He thinks that floods should be stopped because they cause damages, and that they need to be regulated and controlled, the same principles. And especially arguing that you need certainty of supply and extension of area under irrigation. So very simple kind of logics that underwrote both these engineers. But while they were doing that, in their writings, I'm just touching on some of them. There's a lot more. And I hope someone, if anyone is planning to do a PhD on this is a great, rereading their writings there's a great need for much more work on them. Like, for example, Cotton, he writes at some point that he's not dealing with the Virgin River, that perhaps his predecessors, meaning the pre-colonial ruling, like Rajas and elites, and local people, they had been kind of irrigating these rivers as well, irrigating through these rivers. And he writes that they made use of the river, but here's what used to completely confound Cotton, and something that even caught Cotley's attention. Says that the local people do have irrigation technologies, but here's the strange thing. They made use of the river only during the rains, when the waters were least wanted. So he's completely, frazzled. Why would they, why would you want water when it's raining? Something to that effect, yeah? So implicit in what Cotton is saying is that there are irrigation technologies, but they're used when it's raining. That's kind of bizarre. Similarly, Cotley says, he said, yeah, they probably understood perfectly well how to irrigate, but they make cuts into the rivers for temporary spurs and embankments, and use that water essentially during the rains. And really, they divert it for hunting grounds or fountains, gardens, and groves. I couldn't actually find people using the rivers for cultivation. So we have now a kind of bit of a mystery. There is irrigation prior to the coming of the British, but it's definitely under very different kinds of understandings than what the British are advocating and are understanding. Yeah. So what we can say is perennial irrigation, theoretically speaking, there's lots of detail, I won't get into that, is all about making the rivers into stable channels, get them to give an average flow. That is, you don't want a spike, which can be a flood. You don't want a drought, which is bad news as well. Yeah, and turn these rivers into normal channels. That's really what they're trying to do as engineers. And for that, there's a lot of mathematics, there's a lot of engineering training, there's universal principles on which they understand how rivers work. And it's really about control, domination, and training, yeah, at the heart of the whole thing. But I must also add here, somebody, I should throw this idea to anyone. The rivers are mostly feminine. The engineers are always men. And much of that language, if you were to read it in terms of feminist scholarship, is quite startling. It's really talking about dominating women. Really, that's what it appears to be. If you just remove the word river, it's constantly really in that kind of idiom, in those ideologies, patriarchal ideologies, so to speak. Yeah, and so this obsession with control, domination, and training is very kind of striking when you begin to read these the works of these engineers. Yeah. Now, so what in essence perennial irrigation really is that you build a permanent structure in the middle of the river. It may be called a weir, W-E-I-R. It may be a barrage, okay? And in today's sense, it could be also a dam. So you build an obstruction in the middle of the river, impound the water into a large lake, and then you build canals from the sides and take the water where you want it to go. Yeah. So that's roughly the entire philosophical attitude. Now, this idea begins to start evolving, and let me give you one quote from an 1888 booklet, which was, it's an article reprinted from Engineering by J.R.C. Nichols. All right, this is what he writes. If you can be a bit attentive, let me just see if I can move this a bit. Oh, okay, wait. Okay. So he writes here, he says, thus, look at the way they pose the perennial canal against the natural river. Okay. When you talk about perennial irrigation, you are thinking about going against the flow, so to speak. Yeah. All right. So this is what he says. Thus, since a canal is meant to pour water onto a country, whilst the function of the river is to drain it off. Again, a contrast. While a canal is actually to move water into a country, the river actually drains it off. So, they're trying to do two completely different things, opposite things. A well-constructed canal should in every respect be exactly the reverse of the river. So if you're a colonial engineer, the whole idea is to see the canal system as the reverse of the river. It is supposed to be the opposite of the river. Yeah, canals will flow on the highest instead of in the lowest ground, which is where the rivers go, at least in the floodplains. Instead of being reinforced by tributaries and gathering water as it flows on, that's the river, it is constantly being reduced in volume by its branches, and these again by the distributaries and minor distributaries. It will eventually terminate by pouring out water in every direction on those very fields that form the source or collecting grounds of the river. Yeah. So what they say is that the canal, unlike the river which drains away the water, the canal collects from various sources, mainly the river and some other catchment areas, and then spreads it across the land, which then uses it for cultivation. The rivers carry their greatest volume in the wettest season. The canal should then be dry and should carry their highest supply in times of drought. So the rivers, yeah. So you're getting now a kind of a philosophical clarity about what these engineers are doing. They see them actually working against rivers, yeah, right? Natural rivers versus artificial canal systems. Okay, now by 1905, even more bluntly put forward by Scott Moncrief, irrigation may be defined as the artificial application of water to land for the purposes of agriculture. It is then precisely the opposite of drainage, which is the artificial removal of water from lands which have become saturated to the detriment of agriculture. A drain like a river goes on increasing as affluents join it. An irrigation channel goes on diminishing as water is drawn off it. So there you go. You have now a philosophical clarity, and a clarity born out of river management principles that sees the canal as the opposite of the river. All right. So this really is the underlying principles that have gone on to make and run India's modern irrigation infrastructure. It has caused the building of large dams, barrage systems, wires. Yeah, this now is the way that the problem is formulated. As a contrast to the river is the canal. Now, we have most studies now showing that actually what they got confused about is actually a far more, is a different worldview altogether. And that is the inundation canal. And this is a lovely picture painted apparently by somebody called Sitaram in 1810, maybe 1822, I don't know, between those dates. And this is the Ali Mardan Khan's canal at Karnal. Along with an encampment, there's all these elephants of a Raja of Patiala. And this canal is actually an inundation canal, right? So what is the inundation canal? It's not the perennial canal. The inundation canal, before I get into it, let me briefly explain to you what, if you look at the colonial engineering files and records, there's all these kinds of surprises where they show not just frustration, but also surprise sometimes at what they keep finding. So there is this embankment report in Bengal, note on their origins, development, and utility. Very carefully studied, all right? And I found it in the land revenue records in the National Archives of India, managed to get the whole thing. I wrote it by hand many, many years ago, very young, and then I subsequently typed it into a kind of a soft copy, yeah? Now, in this record, here's what they write. The embankments or bunds served a number of purposes. What they find odd is that these embankments, they always associate embankments with preventing floods. But then they find that actually these embankments do many different things, but not flood control. So they exclude salt water during spring tides in Bengal. They dam the mouths of hollows, that's skulls, in order to retain fresh water. They divert water for irrigation, and they lead excess water into drainage channels. So kind of diversion structure. But there are many different functions, but this is not for flood control. So, things are just not adding up. The more they actually get into the question of irrigation by the ideas prior to the coming of the British, they are constantly confused. I mean, something is just not adding up. And the thing about the inundation canal and about these embankments is that they really do not recognize a hard separation between land and water. All right, now for the British, the land is there. And if it's flooded, it's a calamity, and you need to keep the floods out of the land. You need to make sure that the boundary between land and river is policed by embankments. Yeah, but here are embankments that actually are kind of enabling floods. There are more writings now that are getting even more weirder for the British. Okay, so Buckley's famous book of 1880, The Irrigation Works of India. The works may be divided into 5 great classes. Now, 3 and 4, he doesn't know what to do with it. It says chronic canals, works fed from rivers having a supply available during the rainy season only. And we've just gone through a huge amount of writing about how you should keep your canals empty Why are people irrigating during the rains? If you have rains, why do you need irrigation, and so on and so forth. And then here's the fourth one. Inundation canals works drawing the supply from rivers, having a constant discharge of more or less magnitude. Waters only enter the canals at those times when the rivers are in flood. Excuse me, rivers are in flood. So now you're getting even more of these stories about there is something between flooding and irrigation that the British don't seem to quite get. Yeah. Herbert Wilson, an American engineer, very substantial book, very detailed, full of technical drawings and technical descriptions and discussions, 1896. Inundation canals might also be called flood height canals, as they are dependent for their water supply on the height of flood rise in the river from which they are diverted. Now, suddenly we are getting a very clear equation being made between irrigation by floods. Flooding is not a calamitous event, but flooding is somehow linked to irrigation. Yeah, and the most clear-headed discussion on this comes from William Wilcox, who between 1928 and 1930 delivered a series of lectures in University of Bengal, Calcutta University, sorry. And in these lectures, a very famous engineer, he argued that actually there's something which he called overflow irrigation. He said that we've ruined things. The British, by perennial canal irrigation have essentially ruined things. There is a whole history in which people have been making cuts into rivers, and they cut what he described. He says they make these cuts into the river in order to drag the silt onto the land. So he says that irrigation is not about water. It's actually about getting the silt on the land. So he says they cut banks for the red waters of the flowing rivers. Fish eggs, which also enter, then spawn and they eat the mosquitoes. And then the land is being built by this irrigation system. And cultivators created rivers with canals. This is now another very striking thing that he says, that what looks like the Bengal complex of rivers and land is actually an entire complex created by cultivators who are trying to build the land through silt and irrigation. Yeah, there are a few things that I must add if you study Wilcox carefully, and also from other sources on which I'm not going to go into great detail here. I'm almost 40 minutes in. The inundation system is the exact opposite of the perennial system. Okay, it entirely is about knowing your locality. It is supposed to find that point when the flood waters are slightly beginning to decrease and not as ferocious, but carrying all this silt. So you make a cut into the river bank, divert these silty waters to where it wants to go. Another very important difference. So it is, in fact, if you look at, there's no permanent structures. It follows natural drainage lines and really driven by local knowledges. So it's not on universal principles. It's an art. It's not a science. So at different points of the river, people with different ideas about how to make cuts manage irrigation, right? While the colonial engineer was someone who was trained for universal principles, here it's the reverse. The locality makes all the difference. And the community comes together and works through where to make the cut, when to make the cut, and then to bleed the river at a certain point, and then, put that silt into their fields and get the fish and the eggs and so on and so forth. Now, what I'm really trying to underline here is that you've got two completely different systems. Perennial irrigation is really about flood control, It's about the land revenue. It's about creating the peasant in the imagination of the British Empire. Okay? The Inundation Canal is on completely different principles. It has a lot to do with appreciating the river during the floods, understanding when to make that cut, and understanding how to build land through irrigation. Yeah. So for the inundation irrigation, it's a history of flood utilization. While for perennial irrigation, it is a history of flood control. Yeah. So you have two completely different worldviews that are set up really as contrasts. And I would like to argue at some point, I've done a bit of it in different places, and I'm happy to send whoever wants my papers on it, that the paradox of floods and droughts is a colonial construction of the Indian landscape. That actually there are various different kinds of knowledges, various different ways of understanding how not to pose canals as a contrast to the rivers, and how not to and how to tap into flooding regimes, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So I should end by saying that inundation irrigation and perennial irrigation provide us a way to rethink two different worldviews, right? And a worldview based on the idea of the land tax, and another worldview based on actually tapping into the energies of rivers. Yeah. All right. So let me end at that, and I think I was good for time, almost an hour. I'm so sorry. Yeah. So let me stop share now, and I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Okay.